Speaker really needs almost no introduction in terms of the Faraday for me at all. Dr. Denis Alexander, one of the founders of the Faraday Institute, Emeritus Director at the moment, an Emeritus Fellow of St Edmund's College. Denis was previously head of molecular immunology at the Babraham Institute, and previous to that had served in various places as a biochemist and a cancer scientist. He is widely published both in the academic scientist literature and a number of books on science religion, possibly most famously The Creation or Evolution Do We Have to Choose, which I think temporarily we sold out in the bookstore, but I hope there's more been provided there, and a number of two other books that are appearing in the next couple of months, so look out for those. So it's a pleasure to introduce Denis, who's going to talk to us this afternoon on evolution, Adam and Eve, the fall, and suffering. Denis.
Okay, I've been looking at that title the last couple of days and just wondering, you know, what crazy sort of state was I in to even accept doing a title like that. Okay, so here we are. Suddenly the day comes when we have to tackle these things, and of course, I think this sort of subject is going to arouse many different responses from different people of different cultures and different backgrounds. And for some, it might be a little bit boring, actually, because, you know, you're not really interested in that kind of stuff. And for others, perhaps within the Abrahamic faith, I think the topic will certainly be of interest to you, I hope. Although within the Abrahamic faith, people will look at this topic with different spectacles on, with different perspectives. There is an Islamic account of a kind of a fall, but it's very different from the Christian account, and so that will be one perspective. There are many streams of Judaism, Judaistic theology, where original sin certainly doesn't play very much of a role at all, and so forth. But I was thinking of this and thinking, well, at least suffering is something that we all have to do, so that should be of interest to everybody here, I hope. And also, of course, the whole subject of human evolution, without which we wouldn't be here. And so I guess that's of interest to us as well. So I hope, you know, if you're not a Christian from the Christian tradition and you hear me talking about this topic this afternoon, I hope at least you'll sort of look into that tradition and say, oh, so that's how some Christians think about it. That's quite interesting, okay? So I hope you'll be able to do that as well. I hope there'll be something here for all of us. So let's start then with human evolution. I want to give you 4 points, all you need to know about human evolution, okay? There are 4 or 5 slides, and you have the handout there before you. So as Keith was telling us this morning, let's be quite clear that we are not descended from monkeys. We last shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzees about 5 or 6 million years ago. That's based on genetic data, and since that time, of course, they have been going through their various stages to reach from our last common ancestor up until the chimpanzee, have been going through various stages. We don't know the exact number. The oldest fossils of chimpanzees are about 600,000 years ago, so fairly recent. And we, of course, also have been going through these various intermediate stages since our last common ancestor, which are generally known as hominins. And we, as anatomically modern humans, emerged now somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years ago. And we'll come back to that dating in just a moment, but if that sort of range is when the first anatomically modern human populations were identifiable in Africa. So it's best then, of course, to represent human evolution as a tree, or perhaps a bush might be a better idea there, and we can each one of the species on that tree can trace their ancestry back to a last common ancestor. That's a very simplified bush. The bush is getting more complicated almost every week, and it's going to be a very complicated bush by the time we're done, I think. So for most of our existence, we have, as anatomically modern humans, been sharing our planet with other hominins until our Neanderthal cousins went extinct somewhere around 35,000, 40,000 years ago. And that actually makes it quite tricky to trace our lineage down this bush, because there were so many hominins alive at the same time in parallel, and so one's almost kind of spoilt for choice in terms of, you know, you certainly can't pick out any kind of linear type of transition there. You've got a series of hominins who overlap in time and space, sometimes competing for the same resources, sometimes sharing even the same cave, and so on. Now, as far as fossil skulls are concerned, until about a month ago, I would have said that the oldest fossil anatomically modern human skull that we have dates from 196,000 years ago, was described in Nature about 2006, and came from what we now call Ethiopia, the Rift Valley. But this article was published just 4 weeks ago and described a whole series of fossil skulls that had previously been discovered but never really properly dated or properly analyzed, that come from what we now call Morocco, from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. And so these have been dated now to around 300,000 years ago, which, if confirmed, and the dating looks pretty good, that will press back the dates of first anatomically modern humans even further than we had thought. So we're looking here at a moving target, and it all depends on, you know, where the latest discoveries may be found. There's also the fascinating collection of fossil skulls that date from, now it turns out, from about the same period, discovered in a cave, as some people think a burial-like cave, possibly even dating from 236,000 to 335,000 years ago. These retain a small brain and a chimp-like jaw, so in some ways they're quite different from anatomically modern humans, but they're clearly bipedal. And when you look at their hands, comparison there, when you look at their feet, they're pretty similar really to anatomically modern humans. And this is what you would expect if you do believe in human evolution, as I do myself, as an evolutionary biologist, that you would be finding different populations. Remember, it's populations that evolve, not individuals don't evolve. Populations evolve, and as different populations emerge in different parts of Africa. So it's a moving target, as I say, and there's very likely to be more discoveries coming up in the future. But it does look pretty clear that human evolution, early human evolution, took place in Africa, and from Africa those populations spread to other parts of the world. And so how did that happen? Well, this is a very cartoonish kind of picture really of what is thought to happen. Again, lots and lots of dates there to really sort out and clarify and so forth, but it looks like the major emigration out of Africa took place around 60,000 years ago. Population spread towards the east, population spread into Asia and so forth, down into Australia. And then, of course, the weather was pretty bad at that time, but in Europe it was horrible. And so around 43,000 years ago, the ice cap was going back, and the weather in Europe got a little bit better, not so great even now, but we start seeing the early anatomically modern human populations from around that date. And then, of course, you get the wonderful flowering of cave art and so forth in Spain, Spanish caves, and in French caves and so forth. And around about 18,000 years ago, it is thought those early humans waded across probably the Bering Strait and started moving down remarkably rapidly, actually, through North America and to South America and so on. So that's a general sort of picture that that's holding reasonably true. But it's also worth emphasizing these dates are under constant revision. Here's an example from a paper came out in Nature 2015, which is a whole wonderful collection of teeth, actually 47 modern human teeth in this collection, and they come from a cave in South China, and they have pretty good dating from 80,000 years ago. Okay, so already that doesn't quite fit with the model I just showed you previously, where you've got this main emigration coming out 60,000 years ago. There is the idea that there was an earlier emigration out of Africa, and in fact you can see anatomically modern skulls in a cave in Israel, what is now Israel, dating from about 115,000 years ago. And one thought is that that early emigration went further than people had realized and so on. So there's still a lot of things here to work out. But what we do know is that in the out of Africa hypothesis, it's pretty well supported by the genetic data. It has lots and lots of support. Last year, again in Nature, there was a really interesting article published, which was the results of a massive genome sequencing effort. And so they sequenced more than 2,500 different individuals from 26 different countries got complete genome sequence from all these people. And this shows that within African populations, there's much greater diversity than in all of non-African populations put together. And that's, the data is basically there. I mean, you can look at the paper for the detail. But you can see over here, you've got the African populations where demonstrating much greater diversity. And over here, you've got all the non-African populations. So all of those in this room of us who are not from Africa, we are more related to each other genetically in terms of genetic closeness, in terms of closer identity of sequence than the various African populations. And why is that? Well, because there was extensive reproductive isolation of those different early African populations within Africa, huge continent, huge separation due to forests and deserts and so forth and so on. And probably many of these populations were separated from about 140,000 years or more. So and this is the third point is that if you do the genetics again, a number of groups, I think at least 3 papers I read on this, trace back our own human, anatomically modern human population back to a bottleneck in Africa, which goes back probably hundreds of thousands of years, and probably was stable in this bottleneck for some time. It's not just a sudden bottleneck, but was quite an extensive small population that goes back to around about between 9,000 and 12,000 reproductively active humans, anatomically modern humans at that time. So if you go back, you can get to a small population like that. It was never just one couple, just to amplify that point, but it is quite a small community that we all go back to. We're all Africans, as has often been said, under the skin, as it were. And the fourth point I want to mention is until 2010, there was a fairly straightforward kind of replacement model. In other words, the idea was this population came out of Africa and it basically replaced the other hominins that were around at that time, be they Neanderthals or Homo erectus possibly in Asia and so forth. So other hominins that were still alive got replaced entirely 100% by the modern population, the more modern population, without any mixing of genes, without any introgression. It's called very politely in the evolutionary field, meaning sex, okay, just to make that clear. Okay, now from 2010 onwards, it's been clear that we have to modify that kind of model simply because there's now very good data since we've got a couple of really high quality sequences now from the Neanderthal genome sequence. And it's pretty clear that in certain populations of Southeast Asia, between 1.5% and 2.1% of Neanderthals, sorry, this is not from Southeast Asia. This refers to all the population outside of Africa. All of us who are outside of Africa in this room and our roots contain something like 1.5 to 2.1% Neanderthal DNA in our human genome. There's also a first cousin of the Neanderthals called the Denisovans. This is not based on lots of anatomical, sort of fossil data like the Neanderthals. It's based on one tooth and one finger, but that is sufficient because they were discovered in a Siberian cave where you get very good preservation of DNA. And so we have some very good sequence of Denisovan, so-called Denisovan DNA. And it's clear that they are closer to the Neanderthals than we are, but they're on a separate twig of that bush that I showed you. And today, a lot of several populations in Southeast Asia actually contain between 1% and 6% of Denisovan DNA in a human genome. We're talking about people like Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians, Polynesians, and some other groups from Southeastern Asia. Okay, so now it's pretty clear that there has been some introgression during the early years of those populations coming out of Africa and so forth. And so there was some interbreeding with other hominins who left their genetic visiting cards, as it were, in the genome that we all carrying in our genomes until the present day. Okay, we are all walking fossil, or sitting fossil museums, really, demonstrating to us our evolutionary past as we sit here this afternoon. As Keith said this morning, you don't really need fossils. We have the genetic fossils right in us, and that's an interesting thought. So if we take the definition of a biological species as being a population of individuals who do not interbreed with other populations, that's only been unambiguously, clearly the case for the past, let's say, 35,000 years since Neanderthals went extinct. Okay, if you really want to be strict about your definition of a species. Right, so that is a little bit about, that's all you need to know about human evolution for the sake of this talk, okay? There's a lot more, but that'll be enough in order to start thinking a little bit about the theology. So, is there any way in which we could or should even bring the scientific description we've just been thinking about into conversation with the theological descriptions of Adam and Eve and so on that the Bible provides for us? So let me just give you a few kind of preliminary points that have been mentioned, I think, by others as well in other talks. But first of all, a couple of points then about biblical interpretation. I'm sure you know there are 66 books in the Bible. It's a library of books. There are more than 20 different literary genres, and we need to know what kind of genre we're reading when we seek to understand the biblical text. So the chapters clearly, especially the early chapters of Genesis, are full of figurative theological language. Some people call these theological essays. If you want to come up with some sort of type of literature that this is, I mean, I don't think that's terribly important to get that exactly right, but that's the kind of literature I think I would want to suggest we're reading in those early chapters of Genesis. Clearly, in reading those texts, we are greatly helped by the background ancient Near East literature. This has been very thoroughly read and investigated. If you're not familiar with the books by John Walton, which are on our bookstall, I think, then I would recommend those. The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, very helpful. It's not talking about the science, it's putting the Genesis text in the context of ancient Near East culture and literature in order that we might understand it better. Richard Middleton, The Liberating Image on the Image of God, I really recommend that book. It's, well, I would say the best book that I know of on the whole idea of humankind being made in the image of God. It's already been suggested, and I would thoroughly agree with that suggestion, that concordism is not a helpful way to understand these ancient texts. That is the attempt to take modern science and to impose modern scientific meanings onto the texts of the early chapters of Genesis, or indeed any other part of the Bible. It's simply not in the thinking, obviously, of the original writers, and we're in great danger, I think, of missing the main point if we seek to do that kind of exercise and so forth. So texts need to be interpreted within their context. I think we all know, those of us anyway in the Christian tradition, where the first mention of Adam comes, and that is, of course, right in Genesis chapter 1, where the meaning is clearly humankind. Humankind. That's what it means, and some translations talk about humankind there as a translation. And so male and female, he creates them. The image of God is bestowed upon the whole of humankind. Picked up again, Genesis chapter 5 and verse 1 to 2. He created them, male and female, and he blessed them, and when they were created, he called them, plural, Adam. Okay, so that's point number one, Adam. First meaning in Genesis, it refers to the whole of humankind who are made in the image of God. The image of God is first and foremost a corporate entity. It's funny how, of course, being Western, many of us are Westerners, not all, but Western people tend to immediately jump to the individual. Oh, me, I made the image of God. True, but in the context of the Hebrew text, it's first of all a corporate entity. This is a Middle Eastern text. I've lived for 15 years in the Middle East. In the Middle East, we think more corporately. We think more of community. We think more of the whole social order, okay, before the individual. That's a very important point to remember. Then we get to Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 to 3, the second meaning of Adam. And what we find is that it's the man, all the way through that text. The man, the Adam. Okay, and that's interesting because that's mentioned about 20 times. So obviously, the writer is making a point about this. In Hebrew, you don't use the definite article in front of a personal name. So it's not a personal name in Genesis 2 and 3. And so here we have perhaps the man, perhaps the archetypal man, if you like, that's the representative of male and female when we come to Eve as well. And we note in that context there's a perfectly good word for man in Hebrew. That's the word ish, which is used, according to my computer, only 1,671 times in the Old Testament. That's a very commonly used word in Hebrew for the word man. And so the choice for Adam here seems to be a very specific teaching tool being used by the writer of Genesis, because the Adam comes out of the Adama. The man comes out of the dust. The Adama is, in the Hebrew, it means dust or dirt and so forth. And so then Adam is put in charge of the Adama. Man is put in charge of the dust. He's put in charge of the earth, to till the earth. So there's a huge amount of play on words here, which Hebrew scholars can spend a long time on, which are fascinating, which we miss, unfortunately, in the English translation. Now, in English, if we read that someone's name is human and his partner's name is life, which is, of course, what Eve means, then we quickly develop an impression of what is being communicated. For example, in Pilgrim's Progress, we have the characters there are named Christian, faithful, and hopeful. They represent something. They're representative of a bigger picture. And I would want to suggest that's what we're beginning to get here in Genesis 2 and 3. So these characters, by virtue of assigned names, are larger than the historical characters to whom they refer. They're referring to something beyond themselves, bigger than just themselves. And it is the archetypal man and the archetypal woman who then disobey God in Genesis chapter 3, leading to separation from the tree of life, from alienation from the life of God. Sometimes people describe that as spiritual death. And the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is much discussed in the theological literature, generally taken to be interpreted as humankind going their own way, choosing what they believe is the right way, and choosing, in fact, what is good and evil, and so forth, without listening to God's command. So still on Adam, then, we get to Genesis 4, and there we read, finally, we have Adam mentioned without the definite article, and it's now used as a personal name, as someone who marries Eve, who lives for a very long time and has a very large number of children. Okay, so we see a kind of interesting development of thought, don't we, here in Genesis 1. Adam as humankind, and then Adam as the representative man, as the representative Adam, and Adam as the family man who has lots of kids. Okay. And clearly, there's lots of theological teaching going on here, which obviously we need to get our heads around. So after Genesis chapter 5, we only have one single unambiguous mention of Adam in the whole of the rest of the Old Testament. And that's in 1 Chronicles 1:1. That comes in a genealogy. And as someone has already mentioned, I think today, was it? Or yesterday? The days blur after a bit here, but mentioned that, you don't get references back to the fall in the Old Testament literature. So then you go to the New Testament, and there we find something like 11 citations for Adam and Eve, or both of them, and they're used in 7 different contexts in the New Testament. Nearly all those contexts, virtually all those contexts actually, are in the context of teaching about sin. So that's a theological resource you find in Paul and other writers of the New Testament. When you want to talk about sin, you refer to Adam and Eve. And so you get the doctrine of the fall is really much more of a New Testament doctrine in that sense. That's where you find it get picked up. Okay, so how are we going to relate theology? Well, should we relate theology and anthropology at all? We've already heard about non-overlapping magisteria, the idea we should just leave the theological account in one compartment, and we should leave the scientific in another compartment, and we should just, near the twain shall meet. And if you want a quiet life, that is the best way to go. You want a peaceful life, just leave them separate. Okay, there they are. And you don't want to... I find that, of course, very unsatisfactory as an evolutionary biologist, because, as a Christian also, I want to bring these together. I want to say, well, come on, I have more questions I want to ask, okay? I mean, the Bible may not answer them, but at least I want to ask these questions and think about them. For example, chimpanzees don't have religion, as far as we know, okay? So at some point in our history, it must be the case that humans began to experience spiritual life, a personal knowledge of God they hadn't had before, and so forth. And we can ask the question, well, at what point do humans become responsible to God? At what point can they be judged for their actions, to be held morally responsible for their actions? in the course of history. When did that happen? At what point did a community of faith really get going where people worshipped the one true God? They weren't polytheists, but they worshipped the one true God, and they really knew God in a personal way. They became spiritually alive to God. Okay, now, the Bible doesn't answer any of those questions, okay? These are typical modern questions we like asking. And so we're going to move now into a period of, you might call, speculative theology. So please be clear where I'm going with this, okay? We can construct models. We can construct them as, if you like, thought experiments, taking ideas from science in the sense of how we use models in science. How do we use models in science? We have bits of data. We're trying to construct an idea, a speculation, a thought experiment, which would make those data coherent and make them fit together in some way. So I'm happy to call these thought experiments, if you like, and not models. But they should treat, I would suggest, if we're going to do models, we should treat both the theological and anthropological narratives with their own integrity. We want to see how they relate. We first do the theological work. What is the text really trying to tell us? And we do the scientific work. We take both types of narrative very seriously. And then, and only then, do we see how they relate to each other. We're not trying to impose a theological narrative onto the science. We're not trying to impose a theological narrative onto the other way around. Okay, so that's the sort of approach that I'd like to suggest here. And I want to spend a couple of minutes trying to do that. So let's give just a couple of examples of what I mean here. By the way, in the book Creation or Evolution, I sort of mapped out a whole bunch of models because you have various subsets of models and so forth. But I'm just going to stick with two things just to get across as examples here. Here's a kind of model you can think about. Okay, I call it a gradualist proto-historical model. In other words, it's not part of normal history the way we tell it. But this is suggesting that as anatomically modern humans were evolving in Africa over a period, let's say, since 300 years ago, maybe some period during linguistic and cultural development since that time, there was a growing awareness of God's presence upon their lives, to which they responded in obedience and worship according to the light that they had received. Almost as children today, in their development at a very early age, naturally believe in God. You probably know this, a lot of work from cognitive psychology suggesting that young children are natural theists. They find it very easy to believe in God. They find it very easy to believe in the supernatural. And so that gives us a sort of idea of what's going on in this model. The idea is that those spiritual stirrings of humans in the very, very, very early days were in the context of monotheism, and it was natural at the beginning for humans to turn to their Creator in the same way as I say that children naturally seem to be able to believe in God today. And so within that model then, the fall, by the way, a word not used in the Bible, but that sense of that disobedience, that loss from that revelation that they had received, is interpreted as a sort of conscious rejection of that light that they had received, that awareness of God's presence and calling upon their lives, and they ended up choosing their own way rather than God's way, and that was a process that happened over a long period of time. Okay, so that's an idea, and quite a lot of people, would believe that idea. John Polkinghorne here, who's spoken many times for us in these courses, I think would take that kind of idea as being where he would locate himself. There are arguments, of course, against all these models. Don't worry about that. None of them are perfect. But against that model, well, it does tend to evacuate the narrative of any Near Eastern context. And it sort of detaches the whole account, doesn't it, from the Jewish roots. If we're going to sort of look at the early chapters of Genesis there, it's in the context of the Near East. It's in the context, certainly, the story is told as a proto-Jewish story in a sense. So this is where the Jewish people go back to. That's the context of the whole passage and so on. And I guess many Christians, not all Christians, many Christians would see the New Testament's interpretation of Adam and Eve as focusing more on real historical individuals as well. And so there are various things that people might be concerned about that particular model. So another model is, if you like, it's more event-based. It's less process-based, more event-based. It's still proto-historical in the sense there's no written records about this and so forth. But in this, according to this second model, then God chooses a community or maybe even a couple of, let's say, Neolithic farmers who have been called, by the way, the Homo divinus. That was a phrase used by the late John Stott, who was a famous Anglican leader in this country, who was rector of a church right next to the BBC down there in the central part of London, All Souls Langham Place. And he came up with this language of Homo divinus to express this idea that here were a community of people in the Near East that God chose to reveal himself to in a special way, calling them into fellowship with himself so that they might know him as the one true God. And so now here we have the beginning of a spiritual family, a family of those who by God's grace knew him in a personal way, and they were called to be carers of God's creation and called to know God in a personal way. So one way of looking at that would be that these, if you like, are the earliest progenitors of what later on came to be called the Jewish faith. And so linked to this model, it's not essential to have this bit of it, but you know, this is also part of this model, is something that is expressed well here by a previous Bible scholar from here in Cambridge, Derek Kidner, the idea of federal headship. And this is where we touch on Genesis 2 and 3, that hint that what they're talking about there is a representative, archetypal man. Okay, that language is coming in here. So Derek Kidner, who was warden here of Tyndale House in Cambridge, which is a sort of biblical theology research center, he wrote in his commentary on Genesis that with one possible exception, the unity of mankind in Adam and our common status as sinners through his offense are expressed in Scripture not in terms of heredity, but simply in terms of solidarity. Adam's sin is shown to have implicated all men because he was the federal head of humanity, somewhat as in Christ's death, one died for all, therefore all died. Adam's federal headship of humanity extended, if that was the case, outwards to his contemporaries as well as onwards to his offspring and his disobedient, disinherited both alike. Okay, so then this introduces the idea of Adam, if you like, as the representative person of representing, as it were, humankind at that time. So we also, of course, can come up with various metaphors. No analogies really are perfect by any way. But I don't know if you know Ataturk. I lived in Turkey for 9 years. That's why I chose this one. Okay. So Ataturk means the father of the Turks. That's what it means. It's not his real name. His real name is Mustafa Kemal. Okay. But Ataturk means the father of the Turks. So he's sort of the federal head of all Turks. And this doesn't mean, of course, that all Turkish people are literally descended from Ataturk, but it does mean that all the generations of Turks that came after Ataturk find their identity in the modern Republic of Turkey somehow in that founder of the Republic. Okay, that's all analogies are limited, but maybe that gives you a little bit of flavor here of what we're talking about. And Genesis 3 then provides, as I say, this very dramatic, I would say figurative description of separation from the life of God. You've got this fiery barrier separating humankind when they sinned from the tree of life. And so the Homo divinus model would point in a very specific way to sin as a broken relationship with God. Now, if you do a study on sin in the Bible, you find many, many different nuances in that term sin. It can mean many different things. But this nuance particularly is picking up that here we have a relationship with God, a personal relationship with God, and that was broken by disobedience. That was broken by specific actions of humankind in disobeying God and not doing what he wanted. And so that spiritual death then was potent, it was immediate, and it was very dramatic, actually, and that's what you get in Genesis chapter 3. I guess another analogy, which again doesn't pick up all the nuances of this, but maybe some of these analogies might help, or another metaphor, maybe it is really. Let's imagine that there's a president or prime minister of a country, and he makes some terrible error of judgment such that he drags the whole of his country into war. I'm sure we can't imagine that sort of thing happening, but now and again it does. Okay, but suddenly, if you think about it, suddenly he had a stroke, all the population of that country find that they are at war. They might not know that. You know, they're living in the Outer Hebrides, if I can take, sorry, anyone here from the Outer Hebrides? It takes a long time to get there, but, you know, so in other words, they don't know yet there's a war on, some of them, some do. But there's a state of war. There's a state of being at war with somebody else. So due to the wrong actions of somebody else, some silly leader who was too impetuous and just got the whole country into war, they end up in a state of war and so forth. That's sort of a little, gives you a flavor maybe of what this whole sort of model is about. So the very idea of alienation now had come into the world, that very concept. I mean, you can't break a relationship until you have one, can you? So that's the idea. Now, of course, these models raise lots of questions. As I say, I don't think any of them are going to answer all the questions that we might have. But just before we move on, it might just be, for theologians here, worth doing a little comparison here with how this compares with the traditional Augustinian concept, which is very much embedded in different parts of the church community. So in Augustine, you have Adam and Eve who are literally created out of the dust. You have the idea that Adam and Eve, original couple, were physical progenitors of the whole human race. You have the idea that rebellion against God resulted in physical death as punishment. And you have the consequences of that, the original sin that's then inherited by all their successors. And so very much the focus on Christ's death is to solve the problem of Adam's sin. Okay, that is pretty traditional doctrine that you will find all over the place. And I have certainly heard preachers proclaim, and I quote, that sin is in our DNA. Normally, when that happens, I go up to the preacher and have a quiet word with them afterwards. But, you know, I don't think that's a very good description of sin. But anyway, now, personally, I don't see anything in either of the model I've actually suggested that necessarily challenges the kind of overall Augustinian framework of creation, fall, and redemption. What I do suggest is there are a few places where you might want to adjust that and its interpretation, which I don't think loses in any way the whole big picture that we get from Augustine. For example, there is simply overwhelming evidence that we don't come from a single couple. We do not come, so there is no single couple that is the genetic progenitors of the whole of humankind. That simply, I don't think is necessarily indicated by the text, because we've looked at the word Adam is a pretty you know, you had to handle it pretty carefully. And in any case, biblical texts are really not about the science, but they're about the theology. Okay. A further point that might need some reformulating is Augustine's suggestion that physical death is a consequence of the fall. And in some scenarios, this is envisaged as sort of any kind of physical death, including plants and animals, or certainly including animals anyway. And in other scenarios, it's looked on as simply referring to physical death of humans and so forth. But I want to point out then that in both of the models that we just considered, they both view that fall, that disobedience, that initial disobedience of humankind as leading, as I say, to spiritual death, that separation from the life of God that we read about so vividly in Genesis chapter 3. And then if you come, of course, to the very important New Testament passages, we have, for example, Paul writing in Romans 5:8, therefore just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men because all sinned. That was mistranslated by Augustine, well, it was mistranslated in the Latin version of the New Testament that Augustine was using, but the word is because. And so people, yeah, they're contaminated by living in this world where we are all in a fallen state, we're separated from the life of God, and we have this tendency to sin, and then we actually do sin. Okay, so that's the sort of message coming through here. And so the focus of the atonement then is on Christ's death as a sacrifice for the sins of the whole world, not particularly, of course, for the sin of Adam, but also basically even more so for the sins of the whole world. So if we look at that pictorially for a moment, if that helps you, in the Augustinian picture there we have a couple, and then sin is somehow transmitted down through the generations from this original couple who are the genetic, as we would say now, progenitors of the whole of humankind. If you're looking more at, say, the Homo divinus type of model, then this is more about human solidarity, more as Adam and Eve, or the early community of people who knew God as representing, as being the federal headship, if you like, of humanity and so forth. That's the idea. Well, clearly we could say a huge amount more on that topic, and we need to just move on because I want to just touch base a little bit on the other part of this talk, which is going to be really, really brief. And that's, of course, the question of why should a God of love have brought all living things into being, including us, through an evolutionary process that entails so much suffering, pain, and death, and so forth. I don't think we're going to resolve this challenging question in 10 minutes, okay? I just don't think, or even less than 10 minutes, okay? So, and so all I'm going to do is throw out a few thoughts, which I hope will be a stimulus for further discussion. And I want to give also a health warning. What I'm going to say next, some people may not find pastorally very helpful. Some people here have recently lost a loved one. Some people here have recently been through suffering of disease or something. I'm very sensitive to that. And so what I'm going to say, I find as a biologist pretty useful. I went through my own my batch or bout? No, I think it's a bout, isn't it? A bout of cancer, 2014, followed by 12 rounds of chemotherapy. So I know a little bit about cancer. I used to do research on cancer, and then, of course, you get cancer yourself. That's always interesting to see it from the inside as well as from the outside as a researcher. And so I'm sort of sensitive to what people go through, you know, when they go through these kind of experiences. What I'm going to say next, pastorally, I personally find pretty encouraging, actually, and quite helpful. But that's maybe just because I'm a biologist, okay? And if you're a physicist, you might not find it so helpful. Okay. Anyway, what about death in evolutionary biology? I mean, the facts are so well known, I don't think we need to review them there here in much detail. So clearly, biology is sort of a package deal, isn't it? And what I've done here is to make up a great table, which is just a small example of a huge, great table. If you like, listing the pluses of biology and what we like, you know, what is great for us. Life, survival, that's pretty good. Apoptosis, programmed cell death, well, that's pretty important for brain development and so forth, lots of other things. Pretty much anything you write down as a plus on the plus side, you can also write a minus. It's impossible to have biological life without biological death. Okay, so that's one. You can't have survival without pain. We'll come back to that in a moment. Mutations are absolutely essential. Without them, we wouldn't be here this afternoon, because without mutations, we'd all be the same. There'd be no natural selection. We wouldn't be here. Okay, so they're absolutely essential for us being here today. Let's get quite clear on that. Mutations also cause cancer and genetic diseases and so forth. So you can go down the whole list. Okay, even eating food can, you know, generate reactive oxygen radicals, which can contribute to the mutational load and might even be causing cancer. But I think we do need to eat food as well. Okay, so that's the table to think about. So biology is a sort of package deal. And carbon-based life, as I say, is of course impossible without carbon-based death. I mean, we're all part of a food chain. Ultimately, a lot of the energy comes from the sun, not 100%, but you know, if you track back what you had for lunch or whatever, it comes from the sun. Okay, whether you ate plants or animals doesn't really matter. I think sometimes we forget the massive scale of death going on. I call this my cheerful slide. Okay, it's a really cheerful slide. So there's about, it's been estimated as around 5 times 10 to the 30 bacteria in the world. Keith has mentioned in biology we have some really big numbers, okay, much bigger than the cosmological numbers. Anyway, so more than 92% of these bacteria live underground. They're roughly equivalent in weight to all the plants of the, you know, that we have in the world and so forth. And you know, so it's a huge amount of death going on. Cellular to death is just, if you imagine, they're coming and going. They reproduce pretty quickly and they die pretty quickly. But then just think of evolutionary history. More than 99% of all species ever lived are extinct. Huge number. Just think of human death. There's around about 155,000 deaths a day, human deaths. It's about 108 per minute. Okay, I call this my cheerful slide, okay? There we go. And pain, when you look at it, pain is actually an essential aspect of lives of all organisms that have developed neuronal systems, including our own, of course, and as dear old Holmes Rolston said once, the evolutionary process could be titled perversely, the evolution of suffering. The more complex your neuronal system, the more you're aware of pain. Okay, it goes together. The bigger your neuronal system, the more complex it is, the more that awareness of pain is, and so forth. And yet, clearly, pain for us is absolutely essential for our survival. We know that because there are certain unfortunate people who are born without pain receptors. You think, how wonderful, oh, being born without pain receptors. Not at all. Unfortunately, these young people, if it's not identified fairly soon, if they don't receive medical treatment, generally they die as teenagers. And there's all kinds of examples of that in the literature. We need pain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we'd be crunching on broken glass when we have our lunch by mistake, and so forth. We'd be walking around with broken ankles and legs and all the rest of it. We absolutely need pain. One of the dangers of cancer, by the way, is because it's a disease of old age, you don't get much pain necessarily in the early stages of the cancer. We can talk about that. Paul Brandt wrote this amazing book called The Gift of Pain, and he was recruited to India in the late 1940s to help serve those who are suffering from Hansen's disease, which is leprosy, as some people would still call it. And he found that really all the tissue injury and degeneration experienced by his patients was caused by their inability to feel pain. That's what happens in Hansen's disease. You lose your pain receptors and so forth. And he wrote this great book, The Gift of Pain, by Philip Yancey, and with Philip Yancey helped him to write the book. And so this is a wonderful, amazing account, really, of how pain is essential to our well-being. So that gnomic regularity of the world, that law-like behavior of all the matter of the world, is incredibly important. Without that gnomic regularity, there would be no world, there'd be no us, there'd certainly be no free will, there'd be no moral responsibility, there would be no possibility of participating in God's new creation. So in Christian theology, God only wishes people to be part of his new creation, that fulfilled kingdom, who choose to be there. Because he's a God of love. He won't force anybody to be there. There's no room for puppets. And the only way, the New Testament says, to get there is through the portal of death, where our mortal state will be swallowed up by immortality. And incredibly valuable outcomes sometimes demand incredibly costly ways of achieving them. And so the question here is this: could it really be that carbon-based life really is the only way in which intelligent beings such as ourselves, who have the ability to freely respond to God's love or not, could come into existence? We don't know the answer to that question. I certainly don't know. But at least by posing the question, I think we can see the way through to possible reflection on the issue before us. I suspect it's even the possibility that this could be the case that challenges this whole challenge of physical death in our lives, and gives it indeed a new meaning. The world really does have to have these particular physical properties in this view if anyone is going to have the possibility of spending eternity with God. So the cost of existence is the key. The point is that the cost is really, 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 really high. Okay, for us being here, the cost is unbelievably high. Okay, that's the take-home message of the point I'm trying to express here. And in this view, the high cost of the existence of the created order is a price worth paying for the privilege of existence. And our own is not just any kind of existence, but one in which immortality beckons. And for that we can be thankful. Well, that's just a very brief summary of a big, big discussion. Fortunately, there are plenty of other books. I want to just recommend in closing a couple of books. I hope are on the bookstall. This one, you can't see the author. It's actually by Michael Murray, who's now working for the John Templeton Foundation, a very fine philosopher, Nature Read in Tooth and Claw. I think one of the best books on the market on the challenge of animal suffering. Chris Southgate, theologian, The Groaning of Creation, thoroughly recommend that. Of course, in Creation Evolution, Do We Have to Choose also tackles that question as well. But thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dennis. Do you want 5 seconds to just get your brains together and to think of questions for Dennis. I'm sure that's raised lots and lots of issues. Right, your 5 seconds are up. We'll start at the back and we'll work forwards. So Julia, across the side there.
You say that there cannot be biological life without biological death, not carbon-based life without carbon-based death. Are you suggesting then that we will not have biological carbon-based life in the resurrection?
It doesn't look like it. I mean, the only example we have is based on n=1, which is the bodily nature of Christ after his resurrection. And we know that Christ could walk through walls, he could appear through doors, even though it makes a point, doesn't it, in the resurrection appearances, more than once, that the door was closed and Christ was there. And so, and Christ ascended into heaven. Now, we don't know that our resurrection bodies will be exactly like the body of Christ in that way, but he is, in Christian theology, he's our older brother. Yeah? He's the one who's gone before. And so I guess most Christians think, well, that is the pattern for our life in a resurrection body. It'll be something like that. And carbon-based bodies don't go through doors. You can try one here, but it just doesn't work. Okay, so that would be the thought there, I think. Yeah.
Come forward to Rodney, and then across here, and then further down the front, and then we'll work back again afterwards.
Thank you, Dennis. You said that sin isn't in our DNA, and yet it rather chimes with Dawkins' image of the selfish gene. I mean, surely in our DNA is both selfishness and indeed altruism.
Yeah, I think even Dawkins recognizes that the metaphor of the gene is, you know, the idea of selfish DNA, or the selfish gene, although it played pretty well, you know, in the 70s and 80s. I think he's rather regretted that metaphor. Even Dawkins regrets that, actually, because it's so obvious now that genes are cooperators. And so I want to challenge, first of all, you know, the whole idea of a gene as a selfish item. A gene isn't a selfish anything. A gene, I mean, obviously, without our genes cooperating together, we wouldn't be here. They have to cooperate together in an amazingly complex way in order for development to occur in such a way that we can be here. So there's no such thing as a selfish gene in any kind of moral sense. And even the metaphor, I think, is highly wanting, actually. So I would first of all challenge the starting, perhaps, assumption behind that, you know, behind the question. Now, of course, that raises the broader question, which I think is really where you're going, which, of course, do we inherit stuff from our evolutionary past? Yes, of course we do. Do we inherit aggression? Yes, of course we do. Do we inherit, you know, the struggle for survival in some ways? Yes, of course we do. And so I think sin is, I wouldn't say, I don't think sin is about that. Sin can happen when those drives are misused, when our drives, which come from our evolutionary past, are abused or misused in some way, they become sinful. And so something like, let's take aggression. I mean, aggression, pure naked aggression is sin, clearly, in biblical terms, in theological terms. On the other hand, channeled in the right way, you know, it can be, if you're playing football, it can be a very good thing, you know. And so if you happen to be playing Wimbledon this week, you know, you can channel that into that kind of, you know, you can shout. And I don't think when Andrew Murray's like, when Andrew Murray is playing tennis and screams, I don't think that's sinful myself. I just think this is what tennis players do. But that's part of his evolutionary past. You know, look at the face. Looks like, well, you know, kind of an ape, I think, sometimes, you know. But, you know, you can easily see in that sort of aggression. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that all our drives and our emotions and so on can be certainly channeled in sinful ways. But they don't have to be. They didn't have to be. I think we need to make a distinction there. Yeah.
Coming forward to just there, as I promised, and then on the front row, and then back to Andrew.
As you were describing the arising of spiritual feelings, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were suggesting that monotheism was prevalent at the time, whereas
What was prevalent?
one God idea.
Oh.
Whereas, in fact, multi-gods was far more prevalent, really, up until very recently in human terms. It'll be great for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, I mean, clearly when you look at the anthropological data, I mean, polytheism is the dominant, well, shamanism, of course, earlier. I think most people working in the evolution of religion would see shamanism probably as a sort of default earliest type of metaphysical system, if you like, which is still present, present today, and so on. So, yeah, and so the idea in the Homo Hominidis, of course, that in the midst of that shamanistic or polytheistic or whatever it was, culture, that God revealed himself to those individuals as the one true God. Yeah. Is there any data? Is there any evidence for that? No. That's what I said. I said these models go way beyond, what we know, and they're theological speculation. Okay, so, yeah. But clearly there was religion around, and people were, seeking all kinds of meaning to life, no doubt, and all kinds of things going on. Yeah.
I'm taking them in order, one across here, and then there, and then across bank over there. I've caught your eye.
I just wanted to double check. Can I confirm that the death you were talking...
Right.
Hello?
Oh,
Sorry, Heather.
sorry.
The death you were talking about that led from Adam's sin was spiritual death. If that is the case, then why did Jesus have to physically die and physically resurrect? If it was spiritual death, why can't he just spiritually die and spiritually resurrect?
Yes. Well, because I think, it's a very good question, and one often brought up, I think, in this context. And 1 Corinthians 15 clearly reflects on that question. So I think the point is, actually when Jesus is talking about death, if you want to do a really interesting study, if you happen to be a Christian here and you want to do a really interesting study, do a study on death in the Bible. I know it doesn't sound very cheerful, but it's a really fascinating thing. Okay, so I'm going to go back and come to your question in a moment. So when you look in the Old Testament, death is just what happens to everybody, okay? Now, death can be a judgment. So if you're king and you die young, that's because you were a sinner and pretty bad, so you die young. Basically, again and again and again, the genealogies, they were born, they had the next family, and they died, and they died, and they died. And everybody goes to Sheol. It's mentioned 235 times in the Old Testament, I think. And Sheol is the place of the departed spirits. In the Old Testament, that's the concept they had. Everyone goes to Sheol. And so very often you have a psalmist praying, Lord, lead me not down into Sheol. I don't want to go yet, okay. But there was no concept of judgment after death in that way. The judgment was happening here in this life. And that helps you to explain a lot of stuff going on in the Old Testament, by the way. And so that's the framing. Now, when you come to the New Testament, of course, you get glimmers of resurrection in Daniel and various places in the Old Testament, of course, but there's no developed kind of understanding of judgment after death. When you come then to the New Testament, you suddenly find then death is an enemy. Okay, it's talked about death is the enemy, and suddenly death is seen in a much darker light in some way. Not as just something happens, but it's really an enemy to be destroyed. Well, why is that? Why is that? Well, I think one key is we have to think eschatologically about this, that Jesus comes preaching and teaching the kingdom of God and healing people, and that's the central part of the Gospels, every single page of the Gospels. He's inaugurating the kingdom. He's bringing in the kingdom, and the kingdom brings eternal life. How does eternal life happen? It happens through resurrection bodies. So, in other words, we call it spiritual death. Well, Jesus actually, when he was talking about death, talked about it in several different ways. One way, of course, was just actually what the Bible calls, and the New Testament calls, falling asleep. But Jesus points to, he said the death, in fact, his disciples were asking one day, about this. He said, don't fear those who can kill the body, but fear those who can kill the body and soul. Okay, in other words, it's what Revelation picks up as the second death, this eternal separation from God that Jesus is talking about. And that, Jesus comes to conquer that because he is overcoming physical death, for sure, in his body, in the death on the cross. So it's not looking back to Adam, perhaps so much, and he died physically, and therefore Christ dies physically. That's part of it, but it's much more looking forward to, remember that Jesus is inaugurating the kingdom where there will be no more death, there will be no more suffering. And so he's inaugurating the new kingdom, the new fulfilled kingdom, and is destroying death and sin. Sin, the penalty of sin, says Paul, is death. That's the penalty of sin, eternal death, separation from God. That's what he's talking about. That's a beginning of a discussion on that. And I do go into that in several pages, actually, in the book I mentioned. So that's not going to be a complete answer, but hopefully will be helpful to start with.
Okay, Andrew just here, then across there, and then on the front row.
Is federal headship sufficient to preserve total depravity without any kind of transmission or inheritance, even if it's not biological?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this question has been asked for hundreds of years, and it's not particularly related to evolution or even particularly related to federal headship, I don't think. Because even if you believed in somehow sin being incorporated in the DNA, I mean, you have a problem. In other words, what does it mean for sin to be transmitted? And I'm not sure that transmission is necessarily the most helpful language. I think being in a status, a theological status sin, a theological status of separation from God might be more helpful. But we all have a tendency to sin. But if you ask people, well, how does that work? You know, how? Tell me a mechanism, okay, for that. I think anybody, and I would include myself in that, would be hard put to give you, you know, how do you do a mechanism on that? Now, there's a great temptation there, and we touched on it really, I think, with Rodney's question. So there's a great temptation there to say, well, it's because of our evolutionary past. So there are quite a few theologians now who are interpreting the whole of original sin, the concept of sin, within evolutionary biology. Oh, well, what that's really about, what sin is really about, is about our evolution. And we couldn't help it. Now, I think that's a very inadequate way to understand sin myself. I don't go there. And I think it gives you, well, it lands you up with all kinds of other theological problems, of course. Certainly if you believe, as I do, that God is immanent in the created order and is in that process all the way through of evolutionary biology, so God does create sin then, doesn't he? Yeah. So I think it's pretty important theologically also that we preserve that understanding of human free will, which is all over the place in the Bible, and that choice to disobey God. I think that's all over the place in the Bible. And however we understand it, I personally think those key doctrines are pretty important to preserve. But that doesn't, I don't think your question, I don't know of anyone who answered your question actually. And if you find one, let me know. Because I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer.
So there's a question over there, and then we'll come to the front row.
Hi, Dennis. That was a very interesting talk. I was just wondering, where would the flood, Noah and the flood, fit into your genomic models?
Yes.
Because I think some years ago I remember vaguely a paper either in Nature or Science that, and I think you even referred to it a little bit, that the DNA indicates that a few people were the original people, not, you know, not just two, but still a small number.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Any thoughts?
Sure, yes. No, that's a good question. So, well, I mentioned the bottleneck, if you like, which goes way back more than 100,000 years ago into Africa where... Excuse me? I'm sorry, yes, I should explain bottleneck. Bottleneck simply means if you have a big population, let's say it faces various environmental challenges, and then the population gets smaller and smaller, maybe drought or maybe lack of food or, you know, so that sort of thing. So a bottleneck is simply the population that's reproducing within itself, okay? So this is a reproductively isolated population. It's maybe isolated by hundreds of miles from another population. That population gets very small. That's a bottleneck. And so the genetic data certainly do point to a bottleneck of, as I mentioned, between 9,000 and 12,000 reproductively active individuals somewhere in Africa. But there have been other bottlenecks since then, and that might be, I think, what you're referring to. I mean, certainly the population, it's probably more than one population comes out of Africa, and genetic data are gradually sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of that. But some of those populations we're talking about thousands, a few thousand people, quite small populations. And there have been times that the human population has crashed, you know, it's really crashed to small numbers. But it's never crashed to as small as 8 people. That's what you'd need. Well, I guess, just trying to think of all the people who came off the ark. But anyway, it'd be a pretty small population. Okay, so there is no evidence that it. You know, let's say the flood and let's take that as historical, straightforward account. and you, let's say it's 7,000 years ago, whatever you want, and you have a population of 8 people, there is no genetic data suggesting the whole world population came from only 8 people. Yeah, so I think we can be fairly sure about that one. So.
Here we are on the front row and then further back.
Dennis, I hesitate to ask this because no one would call me a biblical fundamentalist, but there's one aspect of the Genesis myth of the fall of man which you haven't mentioned, and that's the very major role of Satan in the story. Does he come into your interpretation in any way?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are many, many aspects of the account that we haven't looked at. I mean, we haven't looked at the creation of Eve. I thought somebody was going to pick me up on that one. Okay, so maybe they still will. But anyway, because we just, time is against us on trying to tackle everything. But yes, on Satan, I mean, we have this picture of the serpent, I mean, the serpent is pictured in the New Testament as that crafty old devil, the serpent, and so on. So it gets picked up again, doesn't it, in the New Testament? And so there does seem to be a malevolent force we might want to call Satan, or the malevolent force which is tempting from outside, and that leads obviously to the question, well, where does that come from? And there's been theological speculation about that for thousands of years, and I guess not very satisfactory answers have been given. Okay, but it does seem to be that there is a malevolent force that is tempting Adam and Eve from the outside of them, some external force. Now, of course, well, it's a long discussion about that, and it'd be interesting to ask that from Andrew Davison, actually, because I know he's good on that kind of stuff. But I think I'm not a professional theologian, and I won't go further with that, I think, because I think it would be better to listen to a professional theologian on that point.
Thanks, Dennis. In your human evolution bush diagram,
yes,
showing common ancestry with chimpanzees, the common ancestor is the only point on that diagram that doesn't have a species name. Do we have a species name for the common ancestor?
We do not. No, the last common ancestor is, it simply comes out of the genetic data. Yeah, it's the coalescence point where, based on the statistical analysis of chimpanzee genome, the statistical analysis of human genome, you can do, you look at mutation rates, you look at variation rate, you put it all in the computer, and that's what it comes up with. So it's a notional concept at the moment, yes.
But it seems, because your y-axis is calibrated, it seems that we do have species, names for species going back pretty close. It feels as if we're just on the horizon of being able to discover the common ancestor. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It could well be. It could well be, actually, yes. Without the DNA, I mean, the trouble about human evolution, I mean, trouble from purely a scientific perspective and a desire to analyze, is the DNA degrades so much faster in hot climates. And that's why you have the Denisovan DNA, as I mentioned, because it was preserved in a Siberian cave, and so it's very good quality. Now, the sequencing technology is getting better all the time, actually, and so now people are beginning to get some DNA data. They tried from Homo naledi, that's 300,000 years ago, but failed. Okay, but there's always trials to try and get some DNA. That would be wonderful. That would really help to answer that, address that question. So at the moment, to match the fossil data up with the genetic data is quite challenging.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So it's on that, with those older hominids, Dennis, what about Neanderthals? Because they're bigger brains than us.
Yes.
They lived at the same time. They interbred with us. What was their spiritual state? Would you want to speculate?
Thank you, Keith. Well, I mean, there have been speculations that Neanderthal had religion because they buried their dead. Until a few years ago, all the anthropologists I read who do Neanderthal studies seemed pretty convinced that they buried their dead. And now, a couple of years ago, doubt was cast upon that again. The data, actually, when you look at it, are a bit feeble because they're very hollow. Very hollow bits of the ground. Is that really burial? They just happen to die there, get covered by earth and so on. So there's been a bit of a discussion, I know, amongst Neanderthal experts about did they really bury their dead or not? Okay, some people are very firm, yes, they did. And then there was another discovery that they seem to be buried with some beautiful flowers. Okay, and so the idea came Neanderthals were buried with his sort of lovely roses on them or something. But then people pointed out, well, lots of flowers blow into graves, you know. I mean, actually the data, and so what I'm saying is really the data are very flimsy. We don't have any solid data that Neanderthals had religious beliefs. But, you know, it's an absence of evidence, really, and it's always dangerous to build great hypotheses on an absence of evidence there. But, you know, that's the way it's looking at the moment. But clearly, they had fairly, I mean, the tools that we were using at the time and they were using seemed pretty similar. Some people thought Neanderthals kind of borrowed from anatomically modern humans. They sometimes lived in the same cave, not at the same time, but on alternate, you know, so you see alternate layers where they've lived in the same cave and use quite similar tools and so on. So, you know, pretty advanced culture, I would say, and big, beefy, you know, kind of. If they were alive today, we would need a separate Olympics, I think, to cope. You know, they would, well, they have a separate sort of Neanderthal track, you know, where they, especially when it came to putting the shot or something, they were tough, kind of people, muscular.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. I see a hand right at the back there, and then we'll break for a short while.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. If we assume that the models are more likely true than not, then are we saying that Moses believed that and was trying to communicate that to the primary population, the slave population who've been slaves for approximately 400 years, and that they would also have understood it to be something as we say here? And then, of course, in Matthew 19, that when Jesus was talking about divorce, when he was asked by the Pharisees about divorce, the Adam and Eve that he was talking about was, what would you say about them?
When you said the model at the beginning, we've got two models before us, haven't we?
Either of those. So as opposed to the
so,
Augustinian
yes.
model, where
Yes,
we
okay, yeah.
mentioned, you know, a special creation perhaps of Adam and Eve, which has been historically understood, and then there's been an actual fall. And now, what was Moses trying to communicate, and what did the people understand?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that the point here is that when you look at the New Testament or any passage of the Bible, I mean, there's certainly the natural reading of the text would be that they certainly believe in Adam and Eve as real people. I mean, that seems pretty clear to me. And Paul, for example, talks about, you know, when he's talking about the role of women and so forth, he goes into, you know, that Adam was created first and whatever. We won't go there into that passage. But, you know, so in other words, the natural way of talking about individuals, of Adam and Eve, is talking about them as individuals, I think, in biblical texts. So I don't think that, you know, Moses would not have this discussion. He didn't have the challenge of trying to relate the theology to the anthropology. He didn't have that situation, and I just think naturally they thought Adam and Eve were the beginnings of the Jewish people, certainly. So I would see, if you actually look at the genealogies, if you want to go in that direction, then, well, in Genesis 2, it seems very likely with other people around, and there are other people around Genesis 2:3, Genesis 3 more, and 4, Genesis 4. So it seems like there were other people around together with this Adam lineage as well. You remember Cain and how, in that context, he was, you know, they talk about cities and getting refuge in cities, and the implication is there were other cultures around and so forth. I mean, that's what the text seems to indicate. Okay, so I think they would, when we talk about Moses, he would simply be interpreting all that within that context. Obviously, I don't think we need to think that they had supernatural knowledge of advanced science or something at that time. You know. Now, people in the 17th century would disagree with me, as we were hearing just the other day. So, but that's another story. I mean, people in the 17th century thought Adam was a Superman who knew all this wonderful information, and part of science was trying to restore the information that Adam once knew. Really interesting, historically. I don't think Moses thought that, personally. I mean, you know, so they're interpreting within their particular context, I think. And I think their particular context would say, yeah, Adam and Eve was where we began. It's the beginning, it's where Jews, you know, it's the people of Israel, that's where we began. You know, that would be the natural thoughts I think they would certainly have. I think.
On that point, I'll draw this session to a close. Thank you, Denis, for really setting our minds going, for starting our conversation. So many thank you.